For 270 million years, one throne never stayed empty. 5 rulers, 5 ways to kill. $270 million years of blood in the same dark water. But only one of them outbit a Tyrannosaurus, and it never once met a dinosaur. This is the story of fresh water, the deadliest throne on Earth. It changed hands 5 times, and not one of them was taken by force. But it doesn't begin with a monster you know. It begins with one almost no one has ever heard of. Before the crocodiles, before the dinosaurs. 270 million years ago, long before the first dinosaur drew breath, this swamp already had a king. For the small and the careless, this water was a maze of hiding places, but the murk that hid them hid something else too. It doesn't chase, it doesn't stalk. It simply waits, sometimes for hours, until the water forgets it is there. And when it moves, it is already too late. Meet Prionosuchus, nearly 9 meters long if the largest estimates are right, with the body of a crocodile and the jaws of a fish trap. But here's the twist. It is not a crocodile. It is not a reptile at all. Prionosuchus was an amphibian, a distant, monstrous cousin of today's frogs and salamanders. And yet, it looked almost exactly like a crocodile. The same long, narrow snout, lined with teeth built to snap shut on slippery fish. This is one of nature's strangest tricks. Prionosuchus invented the crocodile shape hundreds of millions of years before real crocodiles ever existed. Scientists call it convergent evolution, when the same problem produces the same weapon again and again. Its bones come from the Pedra do Fogo formation in Brazil, and that near 9-meter figure, it's an estimate stretched from a single enormous skull, which means the real animal may have been even harder to believe. But being an amphibian came with a hidden chain. Unlike reptiles, amphibians are bound to water to keep their skin from drying and, above all, to breed. Their eggs cannot survive on dry land. So no matter how monstrous it grew, Prionosuchus could never truly leave the swamp. Its empire had a border it could not cross. The water's edge. In its world, almost nothing could challenge it. The great reptiles had not yet risen. Mammals did not exist. The swamp belonged to fish, to amphibians, and to the largest of them all. For millions of years, Prionosuchus sat at the very top, the apex ambush predator of a world we would barely recognize. It was a design so effective that evolution would build it again and again, in crocodiles, in giant salamanders, and in creatures still to come, in this very video. Prionosuchus ruled, but it ruled in chains, trapped forever at the water's edge. The next king would break those chains. It could leave the water. It grew even larger. And its jaws were strong enough to drag a dinosaur to the bottom of a river. 160 million years later, the swamp has become a river. The world is hotter, louder, and far more dangerous. Because now, the dinosaurs are here. Every animal here shares one weakness. It doesn't matter how tall they stand or how heavy they are. Sooner or later, all of them must come to the water. This is not a clean kill. It is a tug of war, and the predator does not need to win it quickly. It only needs to not let go. Because in the water, it has an ally the dinosaur does not. 4 tons of its own body weight. Meet Sarcosuchus imperator. The name means flesh crocodile emperor, and for once, the name is not an exaggeration. But like Prionosuchus before it, Sarcosuchus is wearing a disguise. It is not a true crocodile. It belongs to an older, extinct branch of crocodile relatives, cousins of modern crocs, not ancestors. That same body shape, that same solution, built a second time by a completely different family. Around 9 to 9.5 meters long, 3.5 to over 4 tons. The largest saltwater crocodile alive today reaches about 6 meters and roughly 1 ton. Sarcosuchus was not just longer, it was 3 to 4 times heavier. And remember the chain that held Prionosuchus? Sarcosuchus had broken it. Scaled, waterproof skin, eggs that could be buried on dry land. It could bask on a sandbank for hours. It could cross open ground to find a new river. The water's edge was no longer a wall, it was a doorway. Now, if you have seen Sarcosuchus on the internet, you have probably heard bigger numbers. 12 meters, 8 tons. Those came from the first major study back in 2001, which scaled the animal up from its skull using modern gharials as a guide. Later work suggested that method stretched it too far. I want to be honest with you here. The smaller figure is the better supported one, and personally, I don't think it makes the animal any less terrifying. A 4-ton ambush predator does not need help. And then there is this, a strange hollow swelling at the very tip of its snout. Paleontologists call it a bulla, and nobody is certain what it was for. Was it packed with sensory tissue to smell prey in muddy water? Was it a resonating chamber, turning its calls into something that carried across the whole river? Or was it simply a signal? A badge of size and status? All 3 remain hypotheses. My own hunch leans towards sound, because hollow chambers usually mean something is being amplified. But I'll say plainly, that is a guess, not a finding. There is still an argument about what it actually ate. Its snout is broader, and its teeth are sturdier than a fish eater's, which suggests it could handle large prey. But some researchers think fish still made up most of its diet. What we can read more clearly is age. Growth rings in its bony armor suggest the biggest individuals were over 40 years old and still growing when they died. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How large could one get if nothing ever killed it? For millions of years, Sarcosuchus owned these rivers. Nothing that walked on land could take the water from it. And then something did. Not another crocodile, a dinosaur. The largest meat-eating dinosaur ever found. And it walked into the river on purpose. North Africa, 95 million years ago. Not a swamp, not a single river. A delta the size of a country, braided channels, flooded forests, and water everywhere. This is Onchopristis, a giant sauskate, several meters long, armed with a snout lined in barbs. In these rivers, it was prey, which tells you something about what was hunting it. And then, something enters the water on purpose. Not to cross it, to hunt in it. Cone-shaped teeth with no cutting edges. They are not built to slice. They are built to hold something that will not stop struggling. Meet Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, around 14 to 15 meters long, longer than any Tyrannosaurus ever measured. But let me be precise, because this gets misreported constantly. Longer does not mean heavier. In body mass, Spinosaurus and T-Rex are close, and depending on the study, T-Rex may well win. What Spinosaurus holds is the record for length. And here is the part of this animal's story that has nothing to do with biology. Spinosaurus was first described in 1915 by a German paleontologist named Ernst Stromer. The original bones sat in a museum in Munich. In 1944, that museum was bombed. The holotype, the single specimen that defined the entire species, was destroyed. For most of the 20th century, everything we knew about the largest carnivorous dinosaur ever found came from drawings of bones that no longer existed. I find that genuinely hard to sit with. We lost the animal twice, once to extinction and once to a war it had nothing to do with. So why do we think this animal went into the water at all? Because almost everything about its body points that way. Its nostrils sit far back on the skull, so it could breathe with most of its snout submerged. The tip of its snout carries a rosette of small pits, likely holding pressure sensors, the kind used to detect movement in water you cannot see through. Its hind limbs are short, strikingly short for a theropod. Its bones are unusually dense, and a 2022 study of bone density concluded that pattern matches animals that submerge, not animals that wade. And in 2020, the piece everyone had been waiting for. A tail. Not a stiff counterbalancing rod like other big theropods. A tall, flexible, flattened tail shaped like a paddle. But then came the pushback. And it is serious. Other researchers ran Spinosaurus through hydrodynamic models, and the results were not flattering. It came out slow, unstable, prone to rolling. A body like that, they argued, could not have chased fast fish through open water. Their alternative, Spinosaurus, was a giant heron, a shoreline predator. Standing in the shallows, head low, waiting, and striking down into the water without ever swimming after anything. Same animal, same prey, same river. A completely different way to kill. And right now, we cannot tell you which one you just watched is the real one. For what it's worth, here is where I land, and I want to flag clearly that this is an opinion, not a conclusion. I think the honest answer is somewhere between the two. A crocodile is not a fast pursuit swimmer either, and it does perfectly well hunting in and around water. Spinosaurus may not have needed to outswim a fish, It may only have needed to be in the water when the fish came past. But I could be wrong, and the people arguing both sides are far better at this than I am. So I'll ask you, which version do you find more convincing, the swimmer or the wader? Tell me in the comments and tell me why. This is the one argument in this video that genuinely isn't settled. One thing we still cannot explain is the sail itself. It was tall, thin, and expensive to grow. Was it a radiator, shedding heat? That idea has weakened. The structure looks poorly suited for it. Was it a rudder, helping it steer? Contested. Or was it a billboard, a signal of size and status visible across an open delta? Display is currently the frontrunner, which is a strange thought. The most famous feature of this animal may have existed for no reason other than to be seen. Spinosaurus ruled the rivers of North Africa for millions of years. And then, along with every other dinosaur on Earth, it was gone. 66 million years ago, the asteroid ended all of it. The rivers survived. The throne did not. It sat empty. And when something finally climbed onto it, it was not a crocodile. It was not a dinosaur. It had no legs at all. 8 million years after the asteroid, the dinosaurs are gone. All of them. And the world has done something unexpected with the space they left behind. It grew a rainforest. In these waters, this was a predator. A crocodile relative, 2 to 3 meters long, with jaws built for catching fish. It has no idea it is not the largest thing in this river. No lunge, no explosion of water. The most dangerous animal in this ecosystem does not need any of that. And it is over faster than you would expect. Much faster. Meet Titanoboa cerrejonensis, around 13 meters long and over a ton in weight, the largest snake known to have existed. For scale, the largest green anaconda reliably measured today reaches around 6 to 7 meters and maybe 200 kilograms. Titanoboa was roughly twice the length and about 5 times the mass. And here is where it came from. Not a desert dig site, but an open-pit coal mine in northern Colombia. Which brings us to an important caveat. We do not have a complete Titanoboa skeleton. That 13-meter figure is an estimate, built from vertebrae, measured, then scaled up using the proportions of living boas. It is a solid method, but it is a method, not a measurement. And I think it is worth saying that out loud, because largest snake ever is a big claim to rest on a handful of backbones. Now, back to that question. Why did the kill happen so fast? Because almost everything you have been told about constricting snakes is wrong. They do not squeeze until their prey suffocates. Suffocation takes minutes, and a struggling crocodile has minutes to fight back. What actually happens is circulatory. The coils compress the body so hard that blood pressure collapses. Blood stops reaching the brain. The animal loses consciousness in seconds, and the heart, deprived of pressure, follows. This was demonstrated experimentally with modern constrictors, and it rewrote how we understand the whole strategy. It is not slow crushing, it is a shutdown. Honestly, I think that is more disturbing than the old version. Suffocation, you could imagine fighting. This, you cannot. There is one more famous claim about this animal, and it needs careful handling. Snakes are ectotherms. They rely on external heat, so the original study argued that a snake this enormous could only function in a very hot climate, and used Titanoboa to estimate the mean annual temperature of Paleocene South America. In effect, a fossil thermometer. It is a beautiful idea. But it has been challenged. Critics pointed out that if the climate really was that hot, An animal of this mass would struggle to shed heat. It would overheat, not thrive. The metabolic assumptions behind the estimate may simply be wrong. So treat the thermometer story as a hypothesis under dispute, not a settled measurement. You will see it presented as fact almost everywhere. It isn't. And one more thing, because this is recent enough that most videos have not caught up. In 2024, a snake called Vasuki indicus was described from India, a madzoid from around 47 million years ago. Its length estimates overlap with Titanoboas. Depending on which end of the range you take, it may have been comparable, or even longer. Both are estimates from incomplete material, so I would not crown a new champion yet. But largest snake of all time may be a less secure title than it looks. But Titanoboa left us something bigger than a size record. The forest it hunted in, the Cerrejón rainforest, is the oldest known rainforest of its kind in the Americas. Layered canopy, familiar plant families. The blueprint of a modern tropical forest already assembled 60 million years ago. That forest never stopped growing. It spread west and north, and it is still there today. We call it the Amazon. Which means the last ruler on this list did not hunt in some alien world. It hunted in the ancestor of the largest rainforest on Earth, in a wetland so vast it had no shoreline. And it had the strongest bite of anything in this video. 8 million years ago, Western Amazonia. And this is not a river. It is a wetland so vast that from the middle of it, you could not see land in any direction. Standing water, flooded forest, and slow channels stretching for hundreds of kilometers. You have seen this moment already. It was the first thing in this video. Now you get to see what was underneath. It does not aim for a limb. It does not aim for the neck. It bites the armor because it can. And then it rolls, not for show, for physics. By spinning along its own axis, it turns 8 tons of body mass into torque and lets its own weight do what its jaws alone cannot. Meet Purussaurus brasiliensis, estimated at 10 to 12.5 meters long and around 8 tons in the largest individuals. And straight away, a correction, because almost everyone calls this a crocodile. It isn't. Purussaurus was a caiman. Its closest living relatives are the caimans still swimming in the Amazon today and the American alligator, which means this animal is not some distant monster. It is the oversized cousin of something you can still go and look at. And now, the number I promised you at the very start of this video. Biomechanical models put its bite force at roughly 69,000 newtons. Estimates for Tyrannosaurus rex vary a lot, somewhere between about 35 and 57,000, depending on the study. So, Purussaurus almost certainly outbit T-Rex. Whether it was nearly double depends entirely on which T-Rex estimate you pick, and I'd rather tell you that than hand you a clean headline. Either way, this is the most powerful bite in this video. And here is the part I keep coming back to. It belongs to the most recent animal on the list. The throne did not get weaker over time. It got stronger, right up until it disappeared. But being the biggest came with a bill, and it arrived every single day. Estimates suggest a large adult needed somewhere around 40 kilograms of food daily. Not occasionally, daily, for decades. An animal like that cannot live in a small river. It cannot live in a shrinking one. It requires a permanent, enormous, food-rich body of water, the kind of place that only exists when a continent goes out of its way to build one. which is exactly what had happened, and it was about to stop. Nothing hunted Purussaurus, nothing outcompeted it. What killed it was geology. The Andes had been rising for tens of millions of years, and they kept rising. Eventually, they blocked the old westward drainage completely, and the water reversed. It found a new path east across the entire continent. And the moment the water found an exit, the wetland stopped being a wetland. The standing water drained. The flooded forests dried into floodplain. The greatest freshwater ecosystem South America has ever had was replaced by something narrower, faster, and far less generous. We still use it. We call it the Amazon River. Purussaurus did not lose a fight. Its habitat was rewritten underneath it, and an animal that needs 40 kilograms a day has no answer to that. The rivers are still there. The caimans are still there, just a fraction of the size. 5 rulers, 270 million years, and not one of them was brought down by something stronger. Look at how each of them ended. One was locked in place by its own biology. One watched its rivers dry. One met an asteroid. One lost the heat its body depended on. And the last one lost its water to a mountain range. Not a single one of them was killed by a bigger predator. Every time the throne changed hands, it was because the world underneath it changed first. I came into this expecting a story about strength. It isn't one. Every animal in this video was, at its peak, effectively unbeatable. And every single one of them was still temporary. Being the most powerful thing in your river turns out to buy you almost nothing, because the river does not owe you anything. That's the part I can't shake. Not that they died. Everything dies. That being the best at surviving was never the thing that decided whether they survived. Which brings us to now. The rivers are still here, but nothing in them comes close to what you have just watched. For the first time in a very long time, the throne is being held by animals a fraction of the size. And those animals are in serious trouble. Freshwater megafauna have collapsed across the planet within living memory. So here's what I keep wondering, and I don't have an answer to it. If a wetland the size of Pebas ever formed again, if the water came back on that scale with that much food for long enough, would something climb onto that throne a 6th time? Or was that only ever possible in a world that no longer exists?